Hello again, I'm Greg. Welcome back, this time to part three of our four-part series on the concept of the hero. And of course, when we're talking about the hero, we also have to talk about the villain, the anti hero, if you will. And they're not exactly the same thing, of course, depending on the narrative, but they are intimately related. So here we have part three, unusual suspects, the villain alongside the cultural imagination. And we're going to work through this sort of shadowy concept, which is indeed the shadow of the hero, either an inner shadow or some other figure external who acts almost as a projection or a kind of immoral foil to the hero's kind of pedantic goodness, if that's the sort of simple version of it. But we'll see that there's a number of variations on that theme and also some demythological or post mythic narratives that kind of flip the script. So let's take a look at that together. Unusual suspects. It is reasonable to suggest that the hero would be nothing without the villain. The latter proves the worth of the former, but in so doing must himself be worthy of similar proof. Perhaps the most famous fictional tandem wherein the dueling duo's dual distinctions appear precisely matched is that of Conan Doyle's Holmes versus Moriarty. Their battle is at once impersonal, they hardly know of one another, and there are but two, perhaps three actual encounters between them. Notice that in Guy Ritchie's latest rendition of the myriad of ongoing renditions of the Holmes kind of franchise, if you will, or the Holmes brand, Holmes and Moriarty are bosom buddies when they're young. Okay, so that's an interesting twist, and I actually quite liked that about this kind of otherwise a little bit cheesy action series. But that was a good plot device for sure. But in the canon, they are basically complete strangers, and yet becomes the most intimate of contests. Moriarty is, quote unquote, increasingly inconvenienced by Holmes's efforts and belatedly realizes that he has run into an opponent whom he must take seriously. That the pulp fiction public of the time was so aghast and to the point of riot when, in taking out Moriarty, Holmes sacrifices his own life speaks not at all to the sense that heroism and villainy are equal parts of our shared world, but rather to the sentiment that we so desperately wish it were not so. Hence the recurring trope of the hero ultimately defeating the villain after an equally desperate fight, and thence bearing witness to his own return, cheating an impossibly foreboding fate. The archetype for all forms of resurrection is Christ, and since Jesus may be regarded as the first recognizable individual in the West, far before the time the concept was even within the cultural imagination, this resurrection is itself personal. Villains may also die hard, but in the end, they do in fact die. This is the fantasy aspect of all adventure fiction. We find its balance in the idea of the evil genius. This specific form of villain is itself so highly unlikely. Okay? It is well known that almost all criminals are rather dim-witted and disorganized, putting the absolute lie to the myriad of police procedurals and detective fictions that are ubiquitously present in popular media. In a word, the reality of crime is that it is, though base, quite dull and repetitive, to the point that no one would watch such a plot. So this evil genius is so unlikely that in granting this rare gift to the dark side, we feel justified in watching its demise. For Descartes, who invented the concept, the character was both a figure of deliberate deception, it finds its literary embodiment in Poe's The Imp of the Perverse, who cajoles us into the absurd, and worse, and so not to be trusted, but also more figuratively a representation of radical doubt. This second aspect was, for the philosopher, a most handy one, because it lay at the very heart of his own vocation. Specifically, as it was so important to the Cartesian method, this intrepid doubt gives the villain a sense that he has himself heroic qualities. The villainy lies not in the ability itself, but in the fact that it has become corrupted. The evil genius is, by definition, a hyperbolic inversion of the usual relationship between talent and duty. The one possessed by higher gifts has thus a higher obligation to her community. Only through sharing their fruits with all does both the gift and its holder justify their own bond. To subvert this is to become evil. But note that the presence of this darker impetus does only morally sully the gift. It does not obviate it. Thus the deinos, the original Greek ethical term for the one possessed by the genius of evil itself, maintains her abilities, and this is, as is said, the entire problem. The raft of talents this character has at his disposal, which Aristotle referred to as deinotes, makes him the ultimate villain. Moriarty is the apical ancestor of this leitmotif, but the devil himself is the archetype. And though the serpent too was cast out of Eden, he has, since that time, made a marginal living by inhabiting the very margins of moral consciousness. Perhaps surprising even to he, certain trends in politics and the pursuit of power have vaulted him back into the limelight now and then, and this is when the deinotes of this shrouded amalgam can reach their fuller potential. The evil genius is thus a kind of halfling creature, publicly appearing as a stand-up citizen, for surely the most successful criminal is the one whom no one suspects, but more privately exerting her authenticity, becoming who she is. The villain's goals are oft almost random. Evil promotes itself simply because it can. But now and again, the human side of the partnership asserts its will to abstracted power, and thence must transmute mere desire into what Weber has referred to as Wert rationalis Handeln, rational action directed to an absolute value. When this occurs, we have a crisis, but we also have a story. The statistical unlikelihood of the Deinos does not prevent its superlative presence in entertainment fantasy. Well, who would have guessed? It's generally expressed, however, in three ways. One, as a protege who is corrupted by hard knocks and mockery, the Joker, or by lack of status opportunity equal to his native wit, Professor Moriarty. Recall we are told that his brother is a station master in the north of England, not a very auspicious position, or is lured by the excesses of power illicitly or even heroically attained. Gaddafi appeared a real-life example of this version, but King David too had his moments. Yet no matter how the villain attains his villainous aspect, in the first formula he remains an outlier, a specific and unique outlaw who, if vanquished, takes his evil with him. 2. It is elsewise when the Deinos is abstracted, as it is when it is another culture, or in our own time, more often a rival nation, which is the villain. In John Buchan, it is Imperial Germany, in C.S. Forester, Napoleonic France, and in Tom Clancy, the Soviet Union, to cite three proverbial pulp examples. Of the three, Buchan is, surprisingly, the most uncompromising, even if Clancy outdoes him in sheer jingoism. There are no good Germans of the type so anxiously sought after the Second War, and sentimentally immortalized in The Sound of Music. It is well to remind oneself that the vast majority of death camp guards and personnel of the Death's Head Special Forces were rural Catholics and rustics, as was Himmler himself. And Buchan's heroes, including at least one woman, are thus hard put to vouchsafe Britain's sunnier promise to the world. For Clancy, your average Russian is no Stalinist, an outlook which even today is hopeful, yet at the very least distant, and thus the crew of Red October are ever so joyful, if so bewildered, at attaining the promised land of the United States. In Forster, who, though he has created the most indomitable hero in the figure of Hornblower, who is, once again, as reported by Gene Roddenberry himself, the direct model for James Kirk and all thereafter, Star Trek would not have existed without Forster's epic, is much more of a realist than the other two authors. If the frogs prance around drinking sherry and referring to England as perfidious Albion, they also craft better warships, possess better captains, and in the end have the better ideas regarding how society should itself progress. And if Bonaparte himself was corrupted by sudden and outsized power, Napoleon III is given a warmer welcome and sent off with the hero's best wishes in the final scene of the life saga. The presage to this seeming volte-face indeed occurs in the earliest scenes, wherein we are informed that Hornblower's birth date is none other than July 4th, 1776. The key point of this second version of the Deinos is that evil itself is not vanquished when the abstracted character is defeated. 3. The Deinos appears in the hero herself. Aha! This is the most sophisticated version of villainy, for the conflict, even if expressed in the common world, and even if there are other, lesser villains afoot, is centered within the heroine's own consciousness. In mythic narrative, this inner conflict is apportioned out by means of projected characterizations, as if one is reading the language of the dreamscape. The hero's foibles are embodied in his sidekicks, and his flaws by way of his enemies. But in fiction, the heroine must wrestle wholly with herself, and instead of projection, we have rather a kind of transference occurring, wherein quite amicable canvases of friends and loved ones are imbued with umbrous palette. The heroine does not at first understand what she is about, either in the world or in her relations with others, and it becomes the ongoing task of her familiars, as proverbial team, to not only join her to the journey of self-verstandness, self-understanding, but also join themselves to it. So in my epic trilogy, Queen of Hearts, it is Melissa who is torn between her loyalty to her deceased sister, which she resents due to a prevalence of bad conscience, and her rationality, which rejects outright the enchanted and supernumerary qualities of both Guinevere and her dark historical twin, Hannah Acton, the latter whom she herself must defeat. She regularly transfers this conflict onto the shoulders of her long-suffering friends, and especially those of her lover, who is herself the very person the arch-villain is truly after. In version 3, then, the genius of evil is all the more canny, expressed by the uncanniness of lodging itself within the heart of the heroine herself. Only by virtue of self-overcoming can the skies of the Déinos be vanquished, and in so doing, the heroine comprehends the very interior of the human condition. In all three, the frisson is created by not only the rarity of such extremities in mundane life, but as well their ability to disturb our equanimity regarding carting around our own character flaws. The hyperbole of version 1, above, allows us to reassure ourselves that we are not, in fact, true villains, just as does the usual type of rapist serve to allow almost all other men the perspective necessary to more civilly manage their own desires. Thus, this most cartoonish form fulfills a Durkheimian function in social life, that of the deviant who proves the customary case for the normative. In version 2, we are compelled to reflect upon both the iniquity and inequity of our own homelands, never for overlong in patriotic adventure, but perhaps for some further time in that more realistic. In the first instance, a flawed home is to be corrected before victory over the villain can be assured. In the second, more historically accurate, the fire not only starts at home, it continues to at least flicker, even after the away game is put away. For the third type, the most wincing portrait of the villain, we race along with the heroine, at first in headlong flight from our own inner conflict, and thence into the very breach of soul-searching, whose outcome is knowing that of the Déinos as she knows herself. For the supreme advantage of this hyper-modernist villain is that she is not only already aware of her own conflicted character, something the heroine has to become aware of, the villain knows precisely how to use it to her best advantage. The canniness of the villain can be measured by the uncanny ability to understand her limits. In never transgressing their boundaries, however bold, she gets the most out of what they themselves frame. Okay, recall Harry Callahan saying at the end of the second film, a man's got to know his limitations, and so here we have the dark heroine, the villain, if you will. She's the one that already knows those and knows how to use them, whereas the heroine, her opposite, is someone who has to kind of discover those along the way. So the villain, at least at first, and in epic fiction over a long period of time, the villain has this kind of characterological advantage over the heroine. Okay? The heroine's journey in pursuit of the villain is really a race to increase the rate of her own self-understanding. That she is behind her adversary is purely a matter of her relative lack of self-knowing, which in turn manifests as deficiencies in both character and project. The proverbial step ahead that villains originally have over the heroes rests fully in their ability to utilize all of their déinotes, and sometimes even all at once. Thus, Melissa, to use our earlier example, finds herself unutterably no match for Hannah Acton, and coming to realize this, she then turns her enemy into her tutor. When she discovers that she is herself Acton's historical half-sister, she then more fully comprehends that they must travel to a time when villainy and heroism were indistinguishable in order to reboot the narrative in which they can become reconciled with one another. For in the end, the villain and the hero are themselves siblings, interacting in mimesis of the estranged relationship between the moral siblings of God and the devil. It is not so much that the villain, in whatever form, coexists with the hero in our ethical consciousness. One's conscience is not the hearthstone of the shadow, but rather the herald of the syzygy. No, it is rather that villainy is the common lot of every person who lives, just as is heroism that uncommon. The presence of conflict in the world may not be mere projection of inner conflict, for most cultures yet today do not include a radical selfhood amongst their leitmotifs, either mythic or mundane. Even so, to understand worldly conflict is not only to have deciphered that mythical, but as well to have investigated that personal. Insofar as fiction is the morganatic child of both myth and conscience, our furthest insight emanating therefrom is that, unlike the world which ultimately worlds itself, art can have no alien quality, no life truly of its own. And nor does it wish it so, for its entire purpose is to aid in the transcendence of the selfhood of the present, and thence to point off to a futural horizon beyond which is found the unusual wisdom of heroic villainy. Thank you again.